So we are live now. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thanks once again for joining us in the second episode of this series. Is just culture desirable for learning? So we we did the first session with eight of us. This time we have four instead of eight. In fact, nine. We have Diane with us. We have Neil. We have Oessur, who we can't see at the moment, but I'm sure he'll come back in a minute. And we have Nektarios. So we had some great feedback the first time, very constructive. One of the things we didn't do very well was we went too much into the breadth, and we didn't have time to unpack some of the things. So one of the purposes of this session is to go a little bit more deeper this time rather than going too loose. Uh, the second thing which is important is to really unpack the meaning of just culture and learning. I think there's three words there: justice, culture, and learning, and it's very abstract in some sense. So we'll try and unpack them a little bit. Um, so I think that would be so. We'll keep it. There's no. It's not as structured as it is as it was last time. It'll be much more organic the way we go. What I'd like to do is a start. Maybe ask Oessur what he thinks about it.
Yeah, uh, putting some depth to it. It's tempting to when putting some depth into concepts like just culture or safety culture, stuff like that. It tends to go into an academic depth, academic discussions about what just is, what culture is, and that will be an endless discussion on that. As an accident investigator, I'm preoccupied with what happens in organizations as we investigate organizations. How do these safety-related theoretical concepts, how do they perform in the wild? What happens to these theoretical constructs when they appear in organizations? And how organizations translate these rather academic concepts into something tangible. And to put it short, what happens, we observe something really interesting, which is that we come across some organizations with well-developed practices of just culture, where the managers make themselves accountable for what happens, for the incidents, and then for learning. And the frontline workers also participate very closely with the managers. What characterizes these companies or organizations is that they are quite small, often family-owned, and they have no idea of what just culture is, but they perform it nonetheless on an everyday basis, and they learn a lot from it by using this. There's a trust in the organization of fairness, letting people be heard, and so on. Now, this does not translate very well into the larger organizations that we meet, the larger shipping companies, where quite the opposite happens. That they have very clear just culture concepts in play, procedures, organizational structures in place. But what happens is exactly the opposite. They design a culture of injustice, where the just culture concept and the procedures are used for, say, getting rid of people. It's used for overly responsibilization. And what we typically hear from these managers is the pressure of the competing demands from outside, of accountability from regulators, from liability issues, civil liability issues, and so on. The customers demand that somebody is being fired, and so on. So there's responsibilization. So there is this element of that. And what we have an interest in is to understand how these concepts translate into in the world in form of systems, really. And that is what we're curious about. How is this? Do we have success stories of this on how just culture really can be in large organizations also be implemented?
Fascinating. I'm hearing a few things here, Oessur. One is, can a process deliver justice? And particularly so if you go from a small scale, family oriented organization to something really big, uh, where we almost lose touch with that personal touch with people. You also talk about external motivation to I don't know why I wrote the word. You talk about success stories. I don't know about the success stories, but one of the stories that comes to mind, and it relates to what you said, was a third officer on board a tanker, and there was about 300 extinguishers to be signed off on a monthly basis as a part of weekly inspection or a monthly inspection. I can't remember now, but one of the fire extinguishers wasn't signed off, and it happened to be an inspection on board. An inspector came on board, and he found that one extinguisher was missing. Now, the just culture process or tree or flow chart was applied to it. This person was considered complacent. Why? Because the inspector left a non-conformity for the vessel, which goes against the marketability of the ship. And this person was actually ultimately removed from the company. That became the trigger point for him leaving the company. And I was just wondering, as you spoke, yes, there was a process in place for just culture. That process was used, but did that process actually deliver justice? It's an interesting thing. Nektarios, your thoughts?
Yes, very interesting area. I think the difference between the small and big organizations are in small organizations, you have the procedural justice, how you treat people, and the other type of justice that we call distributive, means how we share the resources, who has control over what, and what expectations we have from everyone, are usually concentrated in a small space and between people. So it's easier to instill this just culture concept. When we talk about big, large organizations, those two areas, I think they are quite separate from each other. So now we're talking about processes. So we have made just culture a function, how to let's say to deliver just culture, which is something like the procedural part, but we forget to connect that with the distributive part. To be a bit more less academic and more clear, to me, justice or fairness has to do with the expectations that we have from somebody who uses the resources under control, but relative to the opportunity given. And when I'm talking about opportunity, I'm talking about individual capabilities, about capacity, about the space and time to decide to act how to use those resources. This is the distributive part of justice. And this is my thought on what Oessur actually said, which I really support. I'm just an explanation of that thing. In big organizations, managers, distribute the resources and they expect from us to have control over everything without taking into account whether we have the capacity, capabilities, the time, all pressures and things. And then when something doesn't go well, those expectations are not met, we have another process, disengage from distribution of resources to come and judge whether it was fair or not, we should be blamed or not for what we delivered.
Interesting. So the independence or the independent notion of somebody coming in the space and kind of trying to ensure that justice is delivered as part of this narrative um, is not very effective in this kind of a
No.
situation. No.
If you
Great.
don't couple distributive and procedural justice, They will not. It's never going to be enough.
Great. Diane, would you like to?
Yeah, well, maybe I could say it in a different way at what Nektarios just said. I do agree with Oessur that in small companies it's more likely to be applied more fairly, and in large companies less so. Now, why is that? Well, there's two reasons. I'm going to just say what Nektarios said, but more simply. Firstly, it's about the mental model of incident causation. And secondly, it's about the process and the wording in the process that's being used for just culture. So let's talk about the mental model of incident causation. So if there is a view in a large company that people are the problem and that the amount of resources, as Nektarios says, are perfect and everything's perfect, and there's no difference between how we imagine work to be carried out and how work is actually carried out, then when somebody makes a mistake on the day, they get blamed for it. And there's a asking for accountability, especially because of the hierarchical levels in the organization. In a small organization, there's less levels. So that's the first thing, this mental model of the systems view of incident causation, or understanding that there's many components and many weaknesses that have to combine together to make an incident happen. Then the second thing is about the just culture process itself. So James Reason's process that he published in 1997 uses criminal law language from Smith and Hogan, 1975, it's criminal law, and it's reckless, negligent, violation, all of those things. They're priming the users to punish people. So I've just brought what has already been said a bit more to life, because in BP, of course, what we did is we took that just culture process that was priming people through the language to cause blame, and we changed it, and we turned it into questions, and we took out the blaming language, and that made a huge difference to the level of learning, because then we were finding out what were the things that were getting in the way of people doing what we were expecting them to do.
It's a great point. Can I ask you a question here, Diane?
Yes.
Is it the questions that made the difference, you think, or was it the language?
So there's two things. One, there are a number of companies who helped us with the redesign, by the way. So Schlumberger, British Airways, obviously Eurocontrol, who said that that a lot of it's about training the users in the modern view of incident causation, the systems view. That's the first thing. The second thing is taking out the language of blame, reckless, negligent, violation, and making sure that it's not a flow chart that leads to focus on just one person. Somebody told us we needed to escalate, and so we did escalate up the line rather than the last person to touch the valve. So your question about language or questions, it's yes, change the language, and yes, change the flow chart so it's questions, so you can have multiple answers rather than just being totally limited. And on top of that, the consistency of messaging within the company, the consistency of training the leaders, that telling people to follow the rules or you'll be punished is just going to take us to a very bad place.
Thanks, Diane. I'll come back to that, but thanks. Very interesting. Neil, would you like to offer your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Some really good points made by the entire team, and I think what I'd like to do really is decouple just culture from the word justice. I think it's an easy link to make, but I think it's a flawed one. And I think Nektarios mentioned the word expectations, and I think we should maybe focus on that a little bit more, because the word justice, of course, conjures up all sorts of thoughts, and some will instantly move towards a punishment type approach. And I absolutely take Diane's point about the language of reason. It's quite inflammatory. I don't deny that. I think equally it's been taken out of context a little bit, but the language does almost push you in that direction. I totally agree. when you look at what he was saying, yes, violation, no one likes the word, but he did make the point it wasn't about bad people, it was about systems and learning. So there was that link already in the words, but unfortunately the language didn't necessarily convey that. So I'd rather talk about fairness and expectations and justice. I think that's a better way to put this. And also I'd like to decouple just culture from a process. And unfortunately, again, I call it that darn flowchart. That flowchart has put people straight into a process mindset. And in my experience, most people that say they have just culture don't. They have a flowchart and they have a process. And it's the easiest thing to create. It's signed off by a regulator, and that's it. And so we instantly think we're doing just culture by then using that flowchart. Too often it's used after an event. Too often it's used to warrant punishment. And I often find that too often it's used by untrained people on the back of a very, very bad investigation in the first place. So the interdependencies that wrap around that flowchart are themselves weak. And the flowchart itself is but 1% of what we mean by just culture. Just culture for me goes back to that whole thing of creating the right environment where we have a settled sense of expectation between leaders, managers, and operatives, and we all buy into that for the purpose of talking about how healthy our system is, how well is it working, how well is it not working, prior to an event. And if we don't have that openness of disclosure, we can only react to bad stuff. So, of course, that leads us to cultural change and changing of people's belief systems, which is not straightforward and easy. And I think that's why we end up creating a process with all the other challenges and pressures that Oessur mentioned there on the organization. There is so much to do in modern day corporate worlds that probably culture change is probably, whilst one of the biggest things to be getting on with, probably one of the last things that ever gets changed. And to add to that, I think as well that just culture itself can almost be bound by the organizational framework itself when it actually needs to stretch beyond organizational boundaries, because there are customers who want maybe to see punishment. There are suppliers who want to see it a different way. And so it's so much more than just internal to an organization. And I think that's a real challenge for any large corporation and even large industry.
Oh, yes. And in this instance, and we have many instances where seafarers have to be sacked because of a charter's requirement, because somebody feels very strongly, the one who's paying for the cargo, somebody feels very strongly that the seafarer acted unethical.
Exactly. Yeah,
But
exactly.
this is where Diane made a very interesting point, which is both the language and the questions, I think, are equally important. And this is how you cascade it to within the different levels of the organization, but go in and out both. So I think that was interesting. Oessur, any thoughts from you listening to all the controversy?
I was fascinated by how Neil linked the almost confusion of terms when we talk about a specific kind of culture, namely a just culture, and then everybody's talking about flow charts and procedures and checklists and policies. And culture is, one could argue, is a bit of a different animal, culture, than this mechanistic, almost Tayloristic view on how organizations are being designed to work in a very specific way, regardless they're working in completely different ways than we might expect. That culture is somehow detached from those instruments, one could say, and then obviously procedures can be facilitators of culture, perhaps not, and that's an ongoing discussion. But going into more depth on this just, now, if we're talking about some sort of sense of fairness and some sort of transparency of what just means in a given organization, then perhaps it's not very beneficial to talk about culture, because it's so diverse across an organization that in order to make a transparent process, to make it somehow predictable, and also to distinguish between process and outcome, because when we talk about just and fairness, is equally about the outcome I am being punished, yes or no, but also the transparency of what kind of process will I undergo before I reach that outcome. Thereby also, we would argue for having transparent procedures for what's going to happen. But how does that relate to culture, per se, really?
I think, sorry, Nipin. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think what we've got to be clear about is what are we trying to achieve with being just, and what does that mean culturally? I'm a very practical individual in that sense. I look at the academia and I then have to practically apply it in organizations. And for me, the way I tend to look at this is from the very beginning of operations and how people not only conduct themselves on a daily basis, but how they interact with others. What kind of disclosure do we have? How do we investigate as an organization? Is it through fairness? Is it giving people the opportunity to be open and honest, and we treat them fairly? There isn't this threat of blame over the top of them. That's all part of the fabric of the organization. And some may say, well, that's culture, that's not. But for me, it's, can we see indicators of culture, I guess, is probably the best way to put that. And very simply, things I tend to look for is when people are raising their hand, is it after an event or is it before an event? That's one simple indicator of potential settled sense of expectation. Yeah. Who do you find out from? Is it your own staff? Is it from your suppliers when the product you've worked on has gone elsewhere? So there's so much to looking at indicators of culture. That's the way I tend to look at it. Does that mean you've got a just culture in a box, in a packet? Probably not. But it's about moving that balance from learning from bad things or reacting to bad things and pushing that onus on the organization to drive a mindset whereby we're open and honest and we're disclosing potential for drift in the organization so we can get onto it beforehand. But that's up against a very, very clear set of expectations that we lay down through the organization. I don't know if I've answered the question that I said there. I was just adding that to.
Oh, no, it is not about answering. It's really about opening up the discussion, which is good. I think if I understood your point, Oessur, right, was that it's almost impossible to create a common understanding about a process, given the nature of the organization, the competing interests, the individual values that people bring to the organization. So I'm just thinking as you're speaking, and that common understanding, the shared understanding, isn't that culture? Isn't that what culture really means?
Well, I could talk all day about different views on what culture means, and sociologists and others, anthropologists, they will discuss all day about that also. Now, there is this semi-religious approach in the most popular definitions of it. It's commitments and beliefs and shared values, stuff like that, and if you fall outside of that, you're a heretic somehow. So there is this religious component to it, which is quite problematic. And arguably there are different notions of what we believe in this company on different levels and so on. And therefore, this culture concept is really, when we talk about it, we can agree on it. When we dive into organizations and make investigations of them, they have very little in common across these different levels. Talking about a common culture is also quite difficult, except from we see from the posters and the marketing campaigns. Now, what can we find commonalities? Well, perhaps. But what my interest was about was this just and the proceduralization of it, and equally so, if we have a disaster, so the impact that the accident has on the organization, can that somehow short circuit the just culture proceduralization there is? So it depends on how serious the event is. How much does it touch upon the self-image the organization has of itself? So if we have minor incidents, Yeah, we can deal with that. But change when the seriousness of the accident changes, does that somehow change their mindset of what just is? Short circuit these procedures.
I think Diane has something to say.
Yeah, it was a kind of a build upon what Oessur and Neil were saying, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to answer your question, Oessur, about does justice change whether it's the mistake cost $10 million or whether it cost $10. And I know in BP we've really worked on that one to make sure that it's the same. Okay. But I do get your point. But where I was going with this was thinking more practically, rather than talking about, well, what is or isn't a just culture, or what is culture. How do you know if you have a just culture is a more useful question. And every company does standard annual surveys. And in every company, there's the same question. I feel free to speak up without fear of retribution. And it goes to Neil's point about, do you hear about things before the incident or after the incident? And so therefore, the people who are listening to this, go and ask yourself, what do people actually say on those large annual surveys that everyone has anonymity? And if you're at 60%, well, probably you don't have a just culture then, because because people are just saying or answering what they think they should say. If it's considerably higher than that, then maybe you do. But but really, there are a number of ways of looking at it, and that's one way that you can understand.
I have a question for Diane.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I just wanted to share my thoughts, Diane, and then Nektarios, you can chip in. Um, you can almost be sure that when people give a response to that answer, to the question that you just posed, it will be a very calculated response. So the question that you're posing is very much at the level of rationality of the human being. And human beings are not rational beings. So what you will hear is a very rational, calculated answer. Yes, it's a very different situation if you tell them, I need to know your answer in 1 second or 2 seconds. It's a very different way. But I think we have to be very careful about these safety culture surveys and the kind of questions that we ask as a way to measure whether a belief system exists in the organization or not. But that's my view.
Well, I get where you're coming from, and I'll explain why. Because safety culture surveys are very invasive. What I'm talking about is an annual attitude survey that happens every year that nobody pays any attention to. So I agree with what you're saying. I totally disagree with safety culture surveys, because they have a Hawthorne effect. So Nektarios.
Yeah, Diane, I really like the comment about this anonymity of the surveys, and made me think about the anonymity of reporting systems. So, do you think that this anonymity in the surveys and reporting system is by itself a signal that there is not just culture? Why should people join the surveys and submitting reports anonymously? If you have a just culture, then everyone should be free to declare the name and the perception, the attitude of whatever they would like to ask.
Yes, and
Why should they hide the names?
Yeah, that's a different discussion, but it's a good point. But I think we should bring back to the original question: can process deliver justice? Which is something that Oessur started off. And let's try and go a little bit more deeper on that. Can a process deliver justice in a large scale organization? And we are not even talking about just culture, because Oessur has just said that just culture is an oxymoron. They don't exist. The two terms cannot coexist. I have a different view on that, but never mind. It's your day today. So I'd like to hear a
Did
little
I
bit
say
more.
that?
Can
Yes.
I continue then on that, Nipin?
Yes.
No, processes do not deliver anything. Humans deliver through the interactions with other humans in the system. Processes can be there to facilitate things, can be used cautiously within the context, within which they're used. I fully agree with what Oessur said before. We have tried to standardize everything because we feel that standardization means fairness, which actually sometimes it's quite opposite. When we see one, solution for everything, then we miss the point there. Yes, you can have a high-level approach, I would say, not a very, restrictive process, because the procedural part for large organization might play a role just for some consistency, but at the same time, this would not mean we don't have the room for humans to interact and put their thoughts there and ask, learn, share, understand, and then all together see what they can get out of its situation. And the process should not always deliver a definite output. It's just a process. Why do we focus on whether somebody should be punished or not at the end? Because this preempts the goal of the process. So it's the process not to deliver just culture, is to find whom to blame. So whereas this will be Neil or Nektarios or Diane, somebody should be blamed at the end if we
And
follow
yes,
the process.
yes, we will expand on that a little bit. But how? Sorry, somebody saying something.
Yeah, I was just going to leap in there. Thanks, Nick. And I think again, it's trying to decouple that flowchart thing from justice, and maybe the purpose of that flowchart hasn't been fully understood by the industries that use it. I absolutely agree, and my experience shows me that when it tends to get used, it's used inappropriately. It does facilitate blame. So people have gone through a just process, but they've still blamed somebody. But again, that was never really the intent of that flowchart. And I know the one in Reason's book many, many moons ago was almost the first iteration of some concept. And you see it in people's manuals. I think we've moved on quite away from that. And there are other flowcharts out there that do a good job at trying to maybe deliver the intent of that flowchart. But again, it's a tiny part of just culture. And that flowchart should only really be deployed in a tiny amount of circumstances. And I think that's part of the problem, that it's almost rolled out as the just culture process. And so the purpose of that flowchart, the reasoning for it and its rationale and what it's trying to deliver, in my experience, is still very, very unclear. And there's some comments on the right-hand side there around, what is just and everything else. But this goes right back to the point that Reason was talking about, the intent of humans and that variability. So today we talk about human performance variability, and Reason spoke about intent. And really, the whole process that we have in that particular field is just trying to bring clarity to the intent of someone's decision making. Was it unconscious? Was it conscious? And all that detail there, because that helps to align to this set of expectations that we have. Yeah. And there's a disconnect between the process and actually what we expect from our staff in the daily operation. And that's part of the problem. We've disconnected safety and everything that goes with it from daily operations. And so there's no surprise that we end up with this kind of confusion around what's fair, what's not. But the fairness of the organization should include and acknowledge human performance variability. And that's all inherent in that flowchart, and that's often missed. In fact, in my experience, it's commonly missed, and people use it as a blame tool.
Yes, let me ask a slightly different question here. Can a process deliver an outcome that is not blame-oriented, right? And we talk about individual and systems. Can somebody tell me a story where you think that was the case, that process actually delivered an outcome that was, yes, Diane, I would love to hear that.
Yeah, so we had the Reason flowchart, and BP, and it was linked to specific types of discipline. Okay, so just as Neil said, and what we saw was that was leading to blame. So we redesigned it, decoupled totally from discipline, and what we found was that after a year and a half, we had 350 cases. That's amongst thousands of issues. Okay, so rarely used. Okay, rarely used, 350 cases, where most of them were system induced, caused by inclarity of procedures, issues with equipment, not enough resourcing. And what that did then was it actually transformed the company, because you know how our companies are, we love data. And the data made a huge switch in the understanding of incident causation of the leadership of BP. And this is written up in an academic paper. This is no secret. It's actually written. This whole thing about how it transformed, took us away from blame, took us away from holding people to account. And so that's and it remains the same. I mean, this was done in about 2012, and BP is still on that track. So that's a practical case study of a reality.
Okay, let me just share an example with you. I've been an inspector on the ground for many years, an auditor on the ground. I would go on board ships every day and start the audit with the following ritual: that I don't want to come and audit an individual here. I'm here to audit the system, right? And people will almost laugh at me. What ridiculous statement are you making? Because I don't believe in what you're saying at all. At the end of the day, you will blame me or you will blame somebody. So that is coupled with another thing, that when I was young as a child, my dad would often get mad at my mom. Mom would get mad at me. I will get mad at my younger brother, and my younger brother would get mad at the dog. And the dog will start to scratch the surface on the ground. And the point being, I still struggle to understand that when we say we don't blame anyone, it's the system. There is somebody in the system that we are still blaming. Somebody will still get hurt at the end of the day. So I'm intrigued by this idea of this dualism between the system and the human. Can somebody enlighten me on this?
I think trying to answer that, we're wired up to blame as human, as a species. We're wired up to blame, and I would slightly challenge the view that we blame for error, and I think we blame for outcome. We see errors, and I'm going to use the word violations here just because it's out there. I think we don't blame for that. I think we blame only when it goes wrong or goes down a path we weren't expecting, and that might cause disruption to the operation or damage to an asset or a human. I think that's when blame comes in. And what we were trying to do 20 years ago with error management, as it was termed, is trying to turn that around a bit and look at the intent of a human. And of course, the intent of a human can be provoked, as Diane said, by the broader system. So there's a connection there. So it was trying to get a shared responsibility between the system performance and individual performance. And of course, with a leaning towards the system influencing humans. So why blame an individual who's in a bad situation and who is powerless to do something? But this notion that we blame for error, I think is slightly flawed. I think we only blame when we have an outcome that isn't appropriate to our objectives. That's when the emotions come out, going back to Oessur's point, that when it's gone wrong, there's an outcome and we want to blame someone. And we've got to get away from outcome and look at intent of humans, but through a systems lens. And that for me is where, if just culture is applied correctly or created correctly, it gives us a better chance of doing that more consistently. I'm not going to say you'll have a just culture. I think you'll have a better chance of doing that more consistently. I don't know if that helps, Nipin.
I see where you're coming from. That's a very Kantian view of a duty-bound view. That at the end of the day, it's about did you fulfill the obligations of your duty, and did you have the right intent? I'm still struggling to understand the connection between thinking about process as a way to deliver justice and how that will ensure learning in an organization, which brings me to another discussion, which is how do we understand learning? What is your view on learning?
I can go if someone else wants to go first.
Yeah.
Well, for me, again, it goes back to, there's that what are we going to learn from? I'm going to spin that slightly. What are we going to learn from? You know, the traditional days of have an accident and learn. Okay, we all know about that. Do we truly learn? Discuss. That's probably another debate for another day. But in terms of, or through the perspective of just culture, I believe it's about what are we going to learn from? What are we going to react to, even is another way to put it. You know, are we going to wait for the bad accident or the bad outcome, or are we going to look at signals of drift, signals of maybe subpar performance, and through the analysis of that, come up with a decision to be made that we can permeate through the organization, managers, leaders, right down to frontline operatives. So I think it's more a question of what are we going to learn from, as opposed to are we learning? And of course, they're part of the same conversation, really. But that's how, coming back to just culture, that was one of its main purposes, to create that upfront learning or potential to learn.
Yeah, I agree with everything you say. I would still go back to the same question. What is the? I mean, Diane used a wonderful word, mental model, and I think that's a beautiful word. So let's just ask everyone around the room to say, what is the mental model that comes to your mind when you think about learning? What is learning?
Can I
Yes.
add here? Learning is change to me. It's not information. It's not just sharing. It's not just talking. When we here now, we don't learn, actually. We just share and we listen to each other. We get this information. And now, whether this translates into learning means translates into some form of change. Although, of course, in theory, we have different learning levels, cognition levels and motor skills and so on. To me, if something is transmitted, is shared, and remains in this sphere of information, of data, without using this information and data to change whatever necessary, then we haven't learned. And sometimes I listen to thoughts and observations that we lose this corporate memory and we don't really learn from the past. No, because we never learned in the past. We just shared information through reporting systems, through investigations, and we didn't really redesign the systems. We didn't change the systems. We just shared the information with everyone, did a few corrective actions here and there without going deep and hard and toughly, into the system. And of course, those pathogens that remain there will manifest themselves in a year, 5 or 10 from now. So I don't think that we don't have memory, organizational memory that much, is that we don't really learn when we have the opportunity to do so.
I love this. I love this idea of learning is change. And I would add just one thing, and that is to look at the reality of work and then change. I think that is missed. And that's part of the issue with these just culture ideas, is that they're not looking at the reality. They're not going deep enough and then doing change. So Nektarios, I love that idea.
That's a great point, Diane, that we can pretend we have a just culture, and then when we get the opportunity to learn, we don't look at the right things. And we go back to that kind of superficial investigation, put some stuff on the table. And I think it was also mentioned, about complacency here. I cringe when I see that in an investigation. Complacent, it's like, of course, it's the easy thing to grab hold of. Either that or failure to follow procedures tend to be the top two human factors that always get drawn out of the drawer. Again, they're indicators of maybe we're not truly learning when we have the opportunity. So it's a really good point, isn't it, that you can be just and enable people to talk openly and disclose things, but does the organization, and here's the point, does the organization truly want that? Because of course, to look deep into its soul creates work. It can cause reputational issues. It can actually cause massive disruption. So I think maybe leaders have to ask themselves a question: do you truly want a just culture, a real one? The prize is you can improve your system. If you don't really want to go through the pain to get there, there may be what I call some silencing techniques that give you a superficial just culture, and you'll carry on as under the banner of, yeah, we're just here, but you'll never learn.
Thank you, Neil. Oessur, you want to say something about learning?
Well, I'm biased by working I have a background in the maritime business, and these concepts, I've only worked with them in maritime domains. And Charles Perrow characterized the maritime domain as an error-inducing system. Now, in relation to learning, when I observe just culture or just procedures, how just culture is conceptualized in the maritime industry, it's completely detached from learning. It's very much focused on accountability issues and drawing lines and processes and so on. But learning is not really an integral part of it. And in the maritime domain, learning is very reactive. When I talk about the maritime domain, I'm aware that there's a large spectrum. But what I'm talking about is the maritime industry that occupies the middle ground. That is very reactive. So they wait for reports to be made and then learn from that. And as Neil pointed out, and you're completely correct, if you do a synoptic reading of maritime accident reports, you read them in parallel, you would find something really peculiar. That if for any given type of accident, say collisions, occupational accidents, groundings, and so on, all accidents are caused for the same reason. It's the same conclusion for all of them, namely complacency, lack of following procedures, some sort of professional norms being transgressed, and so on. So basically, all reports have the same conclusion, thereby also hindering this learning. But in lieu of having connected learning processes with just culture processes, then it's somehow short-circuited, which is really interesting for us. Thereby, there's little learning going on, really. Arguably, the maritime industry is not at any pace moving forward on safety. It's much reactive, and it's much of this, more of the same. More procedures, more bureaucracy, more very simple barrier thinking, isolated to the specific incident. Very little systemic thinking. Lippen, you might protest if this is an unfair description of characterization, broad characterization.
Yes, you're speaking, and I'm thinking, Oessur, I'm still struggling with an understanding of. You say learning is change. What does that look like in practice? Some people say learning is improvement. What if we don't improve? What if we don't change? So where do we look for as practitioners?
Or you unlearn.
Sorry, you say something.
Oh yeah, or you unlearn that the very processes that you have for learning actually is a step back, right? For what you're doing is nobody says that you are becoming wiser. Maybe you are introducing new bad things to do.
Yes,
learning is not necessarily a positive, meaning that what we see when we investigate accidents, that well-intentioned improvements are the causes of the next accident, right? So. And much of the learning is very related to a lot of, not necessarily to make things, more effective perhaps, but not necessarily more safe.
And what I would like to challenge everyone to think about is that, think about Sully. Does he want to learn? Do you think Captain Sully wants to learn? I mean, I'm being very controversial here, but I'll do it anyway.
Do you mean from the particular event he was involved in?
Yes, I mean to say from the Hudson Bay River landing. What could an organization? What is learning then? What is the change that we talk about here?
I guess what we would look at is, we would try and stand back from that entire event from I guess the time when it started to manifest itself, and even probably before that, even beyond the time when all the passengers had been retrieved off the aircraft and And even I haven't seen the movie, but the controversial part in the movie when he's challenged by the NTSB allegedly, for me it goes beyond the bounds of the event and should stretch into the organisation, even the national climate potentially, and even further. I guess that's a question of how far do you go back to learning? Where are the bounds of learning?
I'm being very concrete here. Is that how do you convince somebody like Sully to learn? Because he's a safety specialist now. He goes around, lectures around the world, and I think he has some great things to say. How do we make sure that he also learns? And this is tied into the idea of there was a process. There was an accident investigation carried out. The accident investigation had some clear outcomes. Well, so there was a process that delivered justice in the sense that he was not punished. So how do you link, if that is the idea of just culture as a process to deliver justice, which is then tied in with learning? I'm just curious to understand your view on that.
Yeah, Nipin, I think here we make a dangerous association. Delivering just culture doesn't mean that we absolve everyone from any error or mistake, that somebody does not acknowledge that might have done things a bit differently next time or made a few misjudgments here and there. I mean, if just culture delivers a non-blame, fortunately, outcome, this does not mean that as a user, if I was part of this process, subject to this process, that I don't have the opportunities to learn. What was striking with this investigation, with the Hanso River thing, is that in the beginning, instead of learning from the user, was trying to test whether the user, those circumstances should have performed this way or not. So they didn't first try to understand why things made sense to the crew to act in a specific way. They were trying to do reverse engineering, say, under ideal conditions, with the expectation that something would happen, how somebody else would perform. And if Neil would perform better, what does it mean for me? I'm not Neil, I'm Nektarios. I'm not Diane. Of course, somebody would make a different decision, maybe, would have a different angle here, or a bit thrust, or whatever. This means nothing, but I'm still Sally, and every Sally learns, has the opportunity to learn from the process, regardless of the positive outcome.
I think that's a great point, because just culture in general, the process, is about looking at what made sense to people at the time. And so it takes us so much deeper. If we did it after an incident investigation, and I'm just talking about the process here, we move on from complacency or didn't follow procedure or lack of risk awareness, and we ask, well, was the procedure clear? Did they have enough resources? Was the equipment easy to use? Was it custom and practice? We ask those questions that then it's about what makes sense to them at the time. And then you get the learning, because you're deeper and you can actually make changes to that equipment or that procedure or that resourcing or that custom and practice. So that's what you've inspired me there to say, Nektarios.
That's great, Diane. And just to add a last thing here, is that I will get back to the first point you made, Diane, about the mental model, about how we approach causation of events. And I'm so tired of reading and listening to failure to, lack of. Well, nature hates vacuum and voids. So instead of saying fail to do something, let's focus on what I was doing instead of what you expected, and why I was doing something different than what you retrospectively or by design you expected. It's not lack of awareness. I cannot have lack. I cannot lose my awareness. I was aware of something else than what you expected. So we need to understand where I was looking at and why I was looking there.
Yeah. And in my experience, everybody, those conversations are not had enough. We tend to settle at that first line of conclusion, if you like, if the person didn't do something. And that's where a lot of investigations stop. And so I'll kind of reiterate my point earlier that I think we need to decouple the word just from justice and move towards a fair approach. And fair is about open, honesty, transparency, disclosure, so that we can have the right conversations between people and get a sense of what's going on in the reality of our operation, which was Diane's point. So, yeah, unfortunately, it's got a tag for justice attached to it. But yeah, I rarely talk about justice when it comes to just culture, personally.
Great. We have 4 minutes left, and it would be very, very helpful if we can all summarize our reflections or thoughts before we end the discussion. It's been very interactive. I'm so pleased with this very organic discussion that we had. But let's start. Who wants to go first? What are your thoughts in closing? Please don't take more than 1 minute, because that would mean you take somebody else's time.
I'll go first very quickly. So let's move away from this whole idea about justice and culture. Let's think about fairness. And if you've already got a just culture process in your organization, you really need to redesign it and take out those priming words and educate your leaders on the modern view of incident causation.
Thank you, Diane. Very helpful. Neil, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Just to add to Diane's point, really, about the word justice. I think I've said that now, and I think for me, taking a step back and asking yourself a question of why do we talk about this thing called just culture, and what is it truly? If you've only got a flow chart and a process, that's not just culture. This is a people-focused, systems-focused climate where people can disclose open, honest information so that you can do things prior to an event. And that's how I would summarize that.
Thank you, Neil. Nektarios, you want to say next?
Yeah, my last thought is there's no uniform line or threshold when we're talking about just culture. Whatever process or framework or procedure somebody follows, every case is different and must be evaluated within its context. So, how do you know you have a just culture if every case is different? Indeed, when you learn, you actually become aware of what happened, not what didn't happen, and why it happened, and taking this opportunity to change not the person who missed something or made the wrong decision based on your judgment, but all the factors around within the system that you have control over and you can change. That would be another way to see it. A just culture.
Thank you, Nektarios. Oessur, would you like to offer your thoughts?
Well, I'm thinking about 2 points. Number one is that just culture, we need to be careful not to detach just culture from, say, how we think about accident causation, how we think about system thinking, how we view as our own organization, not as a stable, well-functioning, mechanistic machine that works well until something happens, that we have problems and it's unstable in of itself. And some things can happen. That's a prior understanding we need to have before we can appreciate implementing any sort of just culture. That's one issue. The second issue is we see just culture concepts working quite well in terms of how fairness and transparency in some organizations. And what characterizes them are that they are small, for instance, but also in larger organizations, it is when you detach just culture processes from the operational side, meaning that the person who is designing the procedures, who is telling the operators what to do, that we detach the just culture process from that and placing it somewhere else, say HR or even an outside consultancy company. That we detach the the judgment of whether or not something was morally right or wrong to someone else, not invested in it.
Great. There's a lot to think about, but Neil, Diane, Oessur, Nektarios, thank you very much for your time. It's been a wonderful pleasure and learning opportunity. I'll reflect on it and come back to all of you. And those of you who are listening, thank you very much for joining this session. I think it was a great summing up and a very well. We try to make it as 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 um, as possible it could be to a crystallized question, which was, can process deliver justice, and and can, how does that link with learning and what learning really means. There's a lot to talk about it and think about it, and there's entire series ahead of us. There's at least 4 more sessions lined up, so we hope to see you again. Once again, thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nipin.
I will end
Thanks
the
all.
broadcast here.